Thank you. I want to thank the Department of Linguistics and the Slavic Department and the Institute for this warm welcome here. It's been wonderful over these several days to speak to different groups and also to see more of Seoul and the surrounding area. It's quite an amazing place. Much larger and much greener than I expected. Very nice. I was asked by one of the students when I was at the other talk what the title means. Anything goes. Because this is not something that you probably pick up in a normal English dictionary. It actually refers to a very popular song in the 1920s in the United States. And it was just at that time when all of the restrictions from the 1890s and the teens were being tossed off, and women were beginning to wear short skirts and cutting their hair, and proper society thought that this was going too far, too fast, and a song was written about that age. And the question was, you know, that right now anything goes, meaning you can do anything. And so the reason why I use that here is that this is a kind of subtext to the talk today. In this discussion of Surzhyk, and I imagine that some of you have never heard about this, so we will discuss that today, there is really a question of whether there are rules or whether anything goes, whether one can do anything one wants. And so that's the basis of what I'm going to be talking about. Now, one of the most important issues that comes up in the discussion of Ukrainian nationality is the choice of state language. The Soviet Ukrainian language law of 1989 and the Ukrainian Constitution of 1996 assign Ukrainian the status of state language, державна мова, or official language, офіційна мова. Russian can be used in certain contexts, but it is never accorded that status. And that has, of course, been a battle that continues to this day. There have been a number of attempts to, especially by those who live in the east and the south of Ukraine, to raise the status of Russian to official language. But so far that has not happened. That's only one battle that's going on between Ukrainian and Russian. There's another battle going on, and that's the one we're going to talk about today. Namely, the battle for the integrity of the Ukrainian language itself. The fight against what is called Surzhyk. This fight, this battle, which is really between Russian and Ukrainian, has been described metaphorically in very interesting ways. Sometimes it's actually described in military terms of attacks on the Ukrainian language. But more recently, a defender of the Ukrainian language portrayed Ukrainian as an organism under siege, a hapless victim for whom the odds are uneven, the outcome less certain. So we seem to have moved from the battlefield to the laboratory, or maybe to the intensive care ward of a hospital, where this is maybe even more appropriate in this post-Cold War age, where we're always dominated by public health concerns like Chernobyl radiation and chemical weapons and pollution and global warming. So maybe that's even more appropriate. But on this view, Ukrainian and Russian are juxtaposed on sovereign Ukrainian territory. Remember that Ukraine is now an independent country, and it has been intentionally exposed to a foreign virus called Russian. A virus that threatens its very existence. And the product of this infection is a deformed hybrid mixture of Ukrainian and Russian that is called Surzhyk. Now, one of the critics who's trying to defend Ukrainian, whose name is Alexandra Serbenska, and we'll refer to her work later, she published a style manual. It's really how to speak proper Ukrainian. This was in 1994, and it was called Anti-Surzhyk, that is, against Surzhyk, trying to prevent this disease from growing. And she presented some very sober, serious ideas on what was happening. She talked about the earlier condition of Ukrainian under the Soviet government. She said that the totalitarian system devoured, ate up the worth of the individual and the nation, and it did not stop at genocide alone. It was more than simply famine, physical annihilation that was planned. So far as the Ukrainian language is concerned, the Soviet government carried out systematic linguicide. She refers to it as linguicide. The microsystems of the language were shattered. The immune system protecting the stability of its norms was lost. The language lost its natural quality, replaced instead by a quality designed to demonstrate the fusion of the Ukrainians with the other nations, transforming them into a Soviet supernation. And then she went on to say that when a person introduces the words and phrases of another language into his speech without ruining the grammatical foundation or the phonetic characteristics of Ukrainian, he protects its beauty. He makes use of its inexhaustible lexical and phraseological riches. Such a process is natural and no cause for objection. But when he just adds words wherever he may, arbitrarily, dovilno, she says, inflecting words and combining them in accordance with the Russian model, creating phrases contrary to the models of the native language, its speaker willy-nilly becomes semilingual, she says, napivmovnim, adopting a linguistic hybrid. So this is what I wanted to talk about, actually. To what extent can a plan for linguicide be systematic if the means for implementing the hybrid are so arbitrary? She seems to say that anything can be done, and therefore, if that's the case, how can the plan be so systematic? Can any Ukrainian words be mixed with Russian words in Surzhyk, as Serbenska claims, a kind of macaronic speech writ large, or are there constraints on the way they can be put together? Are any Ukrainian nouns and pronouns and adjectives and verbs capable of inflecting according to the Russian model, or only some? Are the phonological norms of Ukrainian violated at will in Surzhyk, or are there systematic speech patterns underlying this hybrid tongue? Are the laws of Ukrainian consciously and purposely violated by alternative laws from Russian, or is there a consistent resolution of structural differences in favor of one or the other system? In short, what are the rules of the game, if any? That's our purpose today, to find out whether there are rules. And of course I'm asking all of these questions rhetorically, because of course I say, of course there are rules. We wouldn't be linguists sitting around the table if we didn't think that there were rules involved. Let's first of all begin with the term, because I think it's kind of interesting and tells us something about the topic at hand. What is the etymology of Surzhyk? In number 1 in your handout, you see that it's Surzhyk in Ukrainian, Surzhynka or Surzhynets in Russian. It also exists in Polish, Sążyca, or in Czech, Surzhykė or Soresz. What it is apparently all are derived from the late Common Slavic preposition son, which means with, and the nominal root raj, which means rye, the kind of grain. So with rye, that's essentially what it means, with rye. Well, that doesn't tell us too much. So it is helpful to look at some etymological dictionaries to understand what that means. According to the famous dictionary of Max Fassmer, Surzhyk is defined as impure wheat with an admixture of rye. Impure wheat with an admixture of rye. When we go to Hrinchiko's dictionary, which is one of the first modern dictionaries of Ukrainian, as you can see at the turn of the 20th century, there are now two meanings. One is mixed bread grains or flour made from them. For instance, wheat and rye, rye and barley, barley and oats, etc. And then the second meaning, very interesting, a person of mixed stock, человек смешанной расы. And he gives the example of Ukrainian and Gypsy, Ukrainец и Цыган. The Academy Dictionary reproduces much the same first meaning, omits the second meaning altogether. There's no talk about mixture of races or anything like that, and provides a new abstract colloquial meaning, which we see here. Elements of two or more languages joined artificially without adhering to the norms of a literary language, impure language. Well, that also seems to almost say that anything goes. In actual usage, Surzhyk in Ukraine typically refers to a hybrid of Ukrainian and Russian. But a closer look at the etymology and its subsequent development reveals a structural asymmetry that we want to keep in mind. And anyone who has worked in semiotics knows that when you put two things together, they're never really equal. If we're seeing something that says with rye, we know that something is up. Something is getting higher status than something else. And of course, that immediately raises the question of what the actual qualitative distinction is. The secondary meanings that we see, like mixed breed or hybrid or non-normative impure language, reveal an evaluative dimension to Surzhyk that derives from the original asymmetry, where you're not talking about a neutral blend of ingredients, but rather an impure, sullied product of contamination. The reference to a mix of breeds, for instance, assumes the pure, positive, unmarked us, as opposed to the admixture of the impure, negative, polluting them. So in Ukraine, Surzhyk most often refers to the language hybrid judged to be impure Ukrainian, and subsequently substandard, inferior, and second rate. Now, of course, Surzhyk technically could involve any two languages, but the one I'm referring to here is really Surzhyk, and then this with this Ukrainian-Russian hybrid status as well. Now, the important thing to realize about Surzhyk is that it really affects the entire grammar. It's phonology, its morphology, its syntax, and its lexicon. And it contains Russian-influenced elements, or a distribution of elements that is not otherwise represented in an identical way in contemporary standard Ukrainian. And it's this total grammatical criterion that may be used to distinguish Russian-induced forms of Surzhyk from Ukrainian dialectal forms or substandard speech. Sometimes people use the term too loosely. They hear somebody speaking a Ukrainian dialect and they say Surzhyk. Well, it's not the same thing. We're really talking about Ukrainian language and some sort of interaction with Russian specifically. That means Surzhyk. The asymmetry that's built into Surzhyk implies a Ukrainian grammatical base and an admixture of Ukrainianized Russian. Let's examine a sample sentence to gain the sense of the dynamics of how Surzhyk works. In the sample that I've given you in number 4, taken from Lada Bilenyuk's dissertation of 1998, we first of all have 3 different sentences, the first in Ukrainian, the third in Russian, and the one in the middle in Surzhyk. And let's see just how they relate to one another. You can see that, in essence, all 3 of them mean it was awkward to speak Ukrainian in the city. We start out with the preposition v, and that seems to be the same in all 3. But the Ukrainian word misti, which is the word for city, misto, is replaced by, and if we look down to Russian, we see it's gorodye. But in Surzhyk, notice that it's not replaced by gorodye. But we know that, we already talked about this morning, that the correlate of Russian g in Ukrainian is h. So that go will be replaced by h. And notice that the ending remains the Ukrainian ending. So it's vhorody. So this is by no means just taking Russian and flipping it into Ukrainian. Some changes have gone on, and some things have been maintained. Then we go to the verb, rozmовляти in Ukrainian, разговаривать in Russian, and notice what we get in Surzhyk. The same elements, if we broke this up into morphemes, roz, and then it uses the Ukrainianized version of govor to hovor, and in this case it's the derived imperfective, so the root vowel O is replaced by A, as it is in Russian. And then the imperfectivizing suffix iva is replaced by Ukrainian uva. So we wind up with rozhavaryuvate, assuming that that unstressed O sounds like A. This is something I'll get back to in a minute. We're not really sure in all cases whether Surzhyk has the phenomenon of akanya that we know exists in Standard Russian. Then we move on to po-Ukrainsky. Well, this looks pretty similar, except that notice that Surzhyk preserves the Ukrainian vowel I. That Y with two dots is the special front vowel in Ukrainian I. I didn't use any Cyrillic because you would be totally confused if I did. The way you write I in Ukrainian is using what in Russian looks like E. And the way you write E in Ukrainian, it was an I with a dot rather than E. So, but you'd get totally confused if you had to keep those apart right now. Then, nezruchno, the Ukrainian form of awkward, is replaced by a corresponding form of neudobno. But notice that the way that U operates in a closed syllable preserves the Ukrainian alternation, nevdobna, rather than neudobna. And then finally, the past tense of the verb to be, было in Russian, but было. So we can see that it's by no means automatic and simple. What parts of Ukrainian get incorporated or remain, and what parts give up to Russian? And when they do yield to Russian, how much? In terms of code switching, Ukrainian might be termed the matrix language of Surzhyk, and Russian the embedded language. Russian the language that's added in. But notice it's not pure Russian that's added in, it's a kind of Ukrainianized Russian that's added in. The matrix language frame model proposed by Skotten, 1997, assumes that both languages are on without equal participation during the production of sentences. The matrix language provides the grammatical frame, whereas the embedded language contributes individual morphemes, whole lexical items, and sentence adjuncts like islands. But code switching takes bilingual proficiency as a given. That is, the ability of a speaker to speak fluent X or fluent Y and then mix them as he or she chooses. A complicating factor in what we're talking about is that Ukrainian and Russian are genetically related. We're not talking about code switching as we see in Spanish and English. It's different because these two languages are very close together. And it's by no means clear from the information available that speakers of Surzhyk have excellent command of Ukrainian and Russian as separate languages. I'm often amused sometimes when I talk to some of these speakers and they're speaking Russian, and I say, so can you speak Ukrainian? And they start speaking what they think is Ukrainian, but half of it is Russian. They really don't see the real difference. So for such speakers, Surzhyk has emerged as a kind of a third language, the grammar of which is closest to that of Ukrainian, but with certain features identical to those of Russian, and others unlike either. So we must distinguish code switching between Ukrainian and Russian that are prompted by specific pragmatic and discourse factors, like using Ukrainian at home and Russian at work, and that happens definitely in Ukraine, and code mixing, in which a speaker switches from one language to the other within the context of a single sentence, with certain constraints operative. In the case of Surzhyk, speakers mix the Ukrainian code with the Ukrainianized Russian code, derived from Russian contact, and not with the Russian code itself. So that's important to keep in mind. So what we're going to try to do is see if we can discern a rule-governed basis for Surzhyk. And I'm going to have to leave aside what are obviously important pragmatic and sociolinguistic and psycholinguistic and political dimensions that deserve separate study, especially the status and function of Surzhyk in contemporary Ukrainian society. That's very interesting because Surzhyk for the Ukrainian government is a kind of embarrassment. They almost don't want to admit that people speak it. So, for instance, in any of the polls that they take, the official polls, I talked to a member of the government, and he said, oh, no, we never include that in any of the questionnaires. They just don't want to even know. So it's very hard to get really detailed information on Surzhyk. It's also interesting, and you may remember back a few years back, 2004 that it came to, it actually was announced, sort of revealed, that a guard that had been posted in the office of President Kuchma had actually planted a tape recorder underneath the sofa in his office and had made hundreds of hours of tape recordings of what was going on. And of course, it was interesting on one dimension, of course, what they're saying in the office. But what was even more interesting for linguists was that for the first time, we actually had hundreds and hundreds of hours of speech, much of which was Surzhyk. So we finally have something to study. Of course, Kuchma denied that he had ever said any of these things, and it even denied that it was actually he himself. But those who know his voice recognize it immediately. And all we can do is say thank you very much to the cleaning lady who cleaned the office every day and never noticed the tape recording bug underneath the sofa. So what about a preliminary typology of Surzhyk? An analysis, of course, depends on reliable data, preferably whole texts of connected discourse that present the hybrid in a functional form of communication. Unfortunately, until we got these tapes, and even those are a little sparse in places, but no such database has existed. Surzhyk is really an oral phenomenon. It's not a written phenomenon. What we have instead are scattered words, phrases, single sentences, and occasional paragraphs found in journalistic writings, prescriptive manuals of the sort I talked about that Serbenska wrote, how to speak correct Ukrainian, do say this, don't say that. And these sources either document the phenomenon or more usually complain about it. But because Surzhyk is largely oral rather than written, there is really a pressing need to get a large corpus of conversations. And of course, once you had such a project underway, you'd have to get all kinds of information about the age of the subject, their social status, their gender, their education, and all that kind of thing. So, in other words, there's so much work to do on this that we're really starting at square one. But one thing that we can do is take a manual like Serbenska has written, where she says, do say this, don't say this, and look at all the things we're not supposed to say, and see if there's any pattern that emerges from that. And that's one of the things that I've done. After we look at some of the things in her list, then what I've also done is to take modern Ukrainian literature. There are certain Ukrainian authors who actually write in Surzhyk. Because when you write in Surzhyk, you create a certain mood and a certain style and a certain type of character that immediately resonates with the reading public. They know exactly who it is. It will be very rough soldiers. It will be gangsters. It will be people in the marketplace. So they know that it will be rock and roll disc jockeys. They use Surzhyk. So in other words, this language has a special function in Ukraine, to be kind of cool, to speak Surzhyk. So we look first to 1994, to Serbenska's manual, and then we'll go from there. Now, starting with lexicon, and we can go to 6 on the handout. I've been able to distinguish these different types of typological categories that we might want to consider in the forms that she gives. In the lexicon, transfers, correlations, extensions, and calques, syntactic calques, morphological selection in terms of roots, affixes, and endings, and then morphophonemic attraction. Which pole does the morphophonemic system run to? Is it Russian or Ukrainian? And phonological integration. So let's first of all begin with lexical transfers and see how that works. The lexical transfers in Surzhyk are Russian-based words or phrases that are not otherwise found in Ukrainian. These do not exist in Ukrainian otherwise. So examples of Russian transfers are underscored in 1 below, with the suggested Ukrainian versions provided by Serbenska. So if we take a form like, we have a large foyer, which in standard Ukrainian would be "Передпокій у нас великий." In Surzhyk, this would come out as "Прихожа в нас велика." Now, where does "прихожа" come from? If you look down to D, you'll see that the Russian word is "прихожая." This is one of the possible ways of saying foyer. But notice that what has happened to make that Surzhyk is, of course, that you have to take the Russian prefix, which is pri, notice that has a soft R. That prefix doesn't exist in Ukrainian, it's pri. So you have to substitute pri. Hoj is accepted, and then you have to provide the appropriate adjectival nominative singular ending, which is a. And it comes out with prichoja. Likewise, if you say take the nails, vizmi tsyachi, and you put it into Surzhyk, you still use the imperative vizmi, but you substitute Russian gvozdi, but not really, because you have to remember to replace the g with a h, so it comes out hozdi. And finally, children, breakfast is ready. Dite, snidati. In Surzhyk comes out dite, zavtrakat, which should look familiar to those of you who know Russian. Whereas you can see, not only is the Russian form used, but in the Surzhyk version, the infinitival suffix is different. Instead of being t, it's actually the soft t. Now, what about lexical correlations? These represent transfers from Russian that are formally close to their Ukrainian counterparts. In other words, there actually are Ukrainian counterparts in this case. So if you take examples like stairwell, where the normal Ukrainian form would be schodova klitka. In Surzhyk, it comes out as lesnichna klyatka. And of course, klyatka is the Russian word. And what we see here is a form where, in this particular case, the e goes back to an old yats. Those of you who know the history of Slavic know that there was originally a sound yats, a tense e. And that was rendered as e in Russian, whereas in most Ukrainian dialects that's rendered as e. So in other words, there is this give and take between the Russian klyatka and the Ukrainian klitka. And ultimately, what wins out? The Russian form. And not only that, but the L gets softened. Klyatka. Now we go to the word for sewer pipe, which is stichna truba in Ukrainian, and in Surzhyk it's stochna truba, which is based on Russian stochnaya. So once again, we get the same kind of form with the Ukrainian ending. Ukrainian has an interesting alternation of O with E and E with E. As you can see in the Ukrainian word for sewer, which would be stik stoku. You see when there's a zero ending, you get the E. Stik, when there's an actual ending, you see the O. Stik stoku, under G. So stichna would be the normal form in Ukrainian, in other words, when the syllable is closed, but stochnaya in Russian, and it comes out as stochna truba. So it's a mixture of the Russian root, but the Ukrainian ending. Then tighten the strap. Remin vkorote in Ukrainian, but remin pidtyanuti. So it's a completely different verb, but what we're interested in is remen and remin. And notice that what we get in Russian and Ukrainian, again, is this e in Russian as opposed to e alternating with e in Ukrainian. And once again, the standard, the non-alternating vowel is preferred e. But what Surzhyk does that Russian doesn't do is have a vowel zero alternation. Standard Ukrainian keeps the e. So it's remin, remenya. That's the normal way that it declines. And Surzhyk keeps that. Remen, remenya. It doesn't become like Russian, remin, remnya. So in this case, it's losing part of the Ukrainian root by generalizing e, but it's preserving the full value of that second syllable. And then another typical representation where pozvonyu, I'll call, ya podzvonyu in Ukrainian, ya pozvonyu in Surzhyk, where the Ukrainian z is replaced by the Russian z. And finally, the diminutive. I know we have somebody here who likes diminutives. The Ukrainian diminutive is rotik, open your little mouth, vidkry rotik, whereas in
Surzhyk, it's vidkry rotik, where we have the Russian form used instead, and notice the T is softened as well as it is in Russian. And the E replaces the E. So that's a lexical correlation. In other words, where the form already exists in some way in Ukrainian, but it's still altered to a certain extent by the Russian counterpart. Now we go to lexical extensions. This is where what you have is an existing Ukrainian lexeme that corresponds with a Russian lexeme, but doesn't exist in as many meanings. And what happens is that, let's say that the Ukrainian lexeme has two meanings. What happens is the second meaning of the Russian lexeme has two meanings. What happens is that second meaning of the Russian lexeme is extended to the Ukrainian lexeme. So, for instance, the dining room is to the right. Well, it should be yidalnya napravo in Ukrainian. But what they've used is stolova napravo. Now, stolova is normally, it exists, but it only refers to table. That is the adjective for table, stolova. But in Russian, we know it not only can refer to table, but it can refer to dining room. Well, that second meaning of dining room is then extended to the Ukrainian form. And therefore, in Surzhyk, it comes out as stolova napravo. Likewise, we correspond. Mi listuyemosa, using the root list, which means letter. Whereas in Surzhyk, we get mi peripisuymosa, and we know that that corresponds to Russian peripisovitsa. But notice that many of the same correspondence of the root remain. Peripisuyemosya. This is an absolutely Ukrainian form, but it's just it's using the corresponding Ukrainian form with the extended Russian meaning. And then finally, yubki, which once again will substitute the Ukrainian word, which would be spidnitsi. Vy shieta spidnitsi, do you sew or make skirts? And vy shieta yubki, where you're substituting the Russian word, but notice, Russian, it's yubki. Here we keep the Ukrainian yubki. So partly it takes it and partly it doesn't. But the important thing is that yubki is extended to have that meaning. Normally yubka is a skirt in a technological sense. You know, like a metal skirt on a machine or something like that. Now, calques may be lexical or syntactic. And in either case, the elements that are put together in the embedded language provide the model of putting them together in the matrix language. So let's take an example, for instance, in 10a, where you get the placement of the articles. So in Ukrainian, this would be rozmishchenya statei, whereas in Surzhyk, it becomes rozpolozhenya statei. What has happened is, and we look down at D, and you can see that we've divided this word up into its component parts, its component morphemes, and every morpheme corresponds. So roz is used as Russian roz, po is used as Russian po, loj is used as Russian loj instead of mishch, and then eny, which is the normal form for this suffix in Ukrainian, is used instead of the Russian eny, and then this is quite different. Instead of the ending being o, as it is in Russian, raspolozhenia, it is a, which is the normal ending for these neuter nouns in Ukrainian. So we come out with this quite weird form, rozpolozhenia, which represents a lexical calque. Likewise, the Ukrainian form for finally would be nareshti, whereas we know in Russian it's nakonyets, and what do we get in Surzhyk? Nakinets. So it's taking the similar form, but still keeping it very Ukrainianized, extending it, and calquing it. And then finally, pokuptsi, shoppers in Ukrainian, based on the Russian pokupatili, comes out pokupateli. Notice that the t is soft, whereas in Surzhyk it's hard, pokupateli. Okay, then moving right along, we come to the possibility of
syntactic calcs. So let's look at some examples. For instance, Russian "совещание по проблемам," where we get the noun followed by the prefix which governs the dative case. Whereas in Ukrainian, this would be narada z problem, the conference from issues, z plus the genitive. What happens in Surzhyk? We come out with the Ukrainian noun narada, with the Russian preposition po plus the noun phrase after it in the dative case. So it is really a combination. Here's a syntactic calc of using this po in a quite different way with that meaning. In other words, a conference concerned with. The concerned with meaning is normally not done in Ukrainian with po plus dative. It's done with z plus genitive. But that syntactic construction is calced. Likewise, 3 competitive examinations. In Russian, 3 konkursnych egzamina, where konkursnych is in the genitive plural after 3. Examina is in the genitive singular, whereas in Ukrainian, it's 3 konkursni, nominative plural, examiny, nominative plural. And what do we get? Surzhyk, 3, the Ukrainian form, konkursnych examina. It's chosen the Russian syntax together with the Ukrainian number. And then finally, at 10 o'clock, where Ukrainian uses not the cardinal number, but the ordinal number, o 10 hodini, at the 10th hour, whereas Russian uses the cardinal v 10 часов, it comes out v 10 hodin. So they substitute the Ukrainian form of the noun, but otherwise it looks very much like a Russian construction. Turning to page 4, the most expensive in Ukrainian comes out najdoroshchi. In Russian, sami dorogoy. And then Surzhyk does them one better, sami doroshchi. So it uses the actual comparative superlative form of the adjectives and adds sami to that. Now this is a construction that exists in neither language, and Surzhyk has actually created its own possibility. Bigger than mine. In Ukrainian, bilshe niż mi, or bilshe vid moho. Niż, this conjunction plus mine, me, this is the pronominal adjective in the nominative, or vid, which is the preposition that is analogous to ot, plus moho, which is the genitive. So either of those constructions in Ukrainian, whereas in Russian it's больше чем мой, or больше моего, and what does it come out in Surzhyk? Більше мого. So using neither of what was possible in Ukrainian. And then, excuse me, пробач мені, in Ukrainian with the dative, извини меня with the accusative in Russian, and we get пробач мене with the accusative in Ukrainian. Once again, extending this syntactic calc. Now, the morphological selection is also rather curious. This appears to be the most conservative part in the grammar of Surzhyk, a result predicted by sociolinguistic experience if you read about these things. It's noteworthy that in all the examples of Surzhyk that are cited in Serbenska's manual, the Ukrainian inflectional endings of adjectives, pronouns, and verbs are preserved intact. So all of the cases that she calls Surzhyk have all of the verbs, all the adjectives, all the pronouns looking like Ukrainian adjectives and pronouns and verbs. It's really the nouns and the numeral dissonances that are altered in some cases. The closed class of morphemes, such as prepositions, prefixes, and pronouns, tend to preserve their Ukrainian formal properties most consistently. So if we take Serbenska's examples and we make a chart to describe when we actually can make changes, we can actually Russify endings or parts of the morpheme, then the prefixes really cannot be altered. They remain Ukrainian. The suffixes of adjectives, verbs, and nouns, they're not altered with adjectives and verbs. They may be altered with nouns. As far as the endings, pronominal endings and adjectival endings really are not altered. They remain Ukrainian. With the verb, you can occasionally get some, but it's not consistent, and with the noun, you can. And then finally, with the root, this is where we see the most alternation. This is where we see the most Russification. So in other words, there really is a hierarchy of Russification, and it forms kind of a squish, as you can see in this chart. So, just to give you examples, Surzhyk has the third-person pronoun vin, for on, yomu, and nim, and not, on, yomu, yim. It has tebe, tobi, and toboyu, and not tibia, tibia, and taboy. The adjectives, forms like Surzhyk, zakazni, list. It does not have zakaznoi, list. In other words, it doesn't use that stressed Russian ending, apparently. It simply uses the regular Ukrainian ending y. Verbs in the non-past, that is the present tense or future with perfective verbs, consistently, over and over again, the third-person marker, t, is always soft, as it is in standard Ukrainian, and not hard, as it is in Russian. So, for instance, in Surzhyk, under 12c1, we have vin nosit, with a soft T, not nosit. It will never have a hard T, as in Russian. 2. Vona ide, znaya, rozumia. Never vona idet, znayet, or rozumiyet. In other words, where Ukrainian has a 0 for that ending, and Russian has an overt T, Surzhyk doesn't even stick in a T. It sticks in nothing. It leaves the 0 there. And so this is the general relationship, is the Russian has a hard T, Ukrainian has a soft T, and Surzhyk keeps the soft T, which occasionally alternates with 0. We see a similar thing going on in the past tense. So the past tense in Ukrainian for a verb like znati is znav, znala, znalo, znali, and it keeps that v. It does not change it to L. We never see znal. Likewise, we see znali in the plural and not znali, as in Russian. So once again, the Ukrainian hierarchy seems to prevail there. In the first plural imperative, Surzhyk has schodimo or schodim, which once again tends to preserve the Ukrainian form as in mo. But there is a possibility of M. But the mo is much more likely, and that's why I have the greater than symbol between them. Surzhyk mo is greater or likely than M for the imperative first plural. And finally, the infinitive, Surzhyk nesti, plakati, zavtrakat. Once again, we can have either one, but Surzhyk tends to prefer T. Now, with nouns, this is where we do see the most Russian incursions. So the vocative form is replaced by the nominative form. Of course, we all know from Russian that there is no vocative, at least the one that we think of inherited historically. So that whereas standard Ukrainian would say Ivana, Hrytsu, Oksano, Natalia, in Surzhyk we have Ivan, Hryts, Oksana, and Natalia. This is exactly what we'd have in Russian. So this, in other words, it eliminates the vocative. The unmarked genitive singular masculine first declension ending u may be replaced by a. So whereas in Ukrainian we get snidanku, the genitive of breakfast, examinu, rotiku, these are all inanimate nouns. These are more than likely replaced by a in Surzhyk, as they would be in Russian, right? Zavtraka, examina, rotika. The unmarked nominative plural masculine first declension stressed ending y may be replaced by a. So whereas in Ukrainian we say doktori, vchiteli, kormi, in Surzhyk we have doktora, uchitela, korma. We of course recognize these endings from Russian. And we get the introduction of indeclinable nouns, which we don't have in Ukrainian. So there is no word like bilyo, it's belizna in standard Ukrainian. Bilyo, of course, is indeclinable in Russian, and it remains indeclinable in Surzhyk. A word like franco is indeclinable in Russian and in Surzhyk, but it declines in Ukrainian. So it's Franco, Franca, Francovi, the dative. Semantically inanimate, morphologically animate nouns are specified as inanimate. So, interestingly enough, the word letter is animate in Ukrainian. Maybe people write very lively letters, I don't know. So the normal way to write a letter in Ukrainian is napisati lista. Whereas, of course, we know in Russian it's napisati pismo. In Surzhyk it comes out napisati list. So in other words, it eliminates that mark of animacy. And then, interestingly enough, singular collectives in Ukrainian are pluralized as they are in Russian. So if you look to 6b, suche listya, dry leaves, is all in the singular. That's a neuter nominative singular collective. Whereas in Russian it's suchie listya, a nominative plural, and that becomes suchi listya, nominative plural, in the Surzhyk. In other words, it's governed by the same thing. Okay, let's move on to page 6, and we can quickly go over this chart just to see which way the morphophonemic wind blows when it comes to Surzhyk operating in the system. There are some features of Russian that it really favors, and other features of Ukrainian that it really favors. So, for instance, the use of g as opposed to h, I think we have already seen enough to know that it favors h. So the first three are places in which, when it has a choice, it is attracted to Ukrainian. So Hruzhchik rather than Gruzchik. The alternation of velar and soft velar as opposed to velar and dental. This is the result of the old historical second palatalization of velars. Surzhyk has na ostanovtsi, at the bus stop, as opposed to Russian na ostanovki. In other words, it preserves that Ukrainian alternation and prefers it. Likewise, when it comes to a choice between I and E, it tends to prefer I. Surzhyk malchik as opposed to Russian malchik. Then places where it seems to be attracted more to Russian, you can see these are largely the vowels. If we see the E in Russian as opposed to the E in Ukrainian, this comes from Old Yaitz. Surzhyk prefers the E. If we have these vowels that alternate in Ukrainian, E alternating with zero and O alternating with zero, as opposed to E and O in Ukrainian, Surzhyk tends to go along with Russian. In number 4, where E alternates with E or O alternates with E in Ukrainian, it tends to prefer the Russian form that does not alternate. Where we get O as opposed to E, for instance in the form like Tyosha as opposed to Teshcha, it prefers the O. And then these didn't all come out, I'm afraid, but they did in the examples, not in the chart. But where Ukrainian has Z and Russian has Z, Surzhyk prefers Z, Russian Z. Likewise, where Ukrainian has J, as in I am proud of, Horjusya, and Surzhyk prefers the Russian zh, Horjusya. And finally, where Ukrainian, when it has a combination of geminate consonants plus yod, which result in geminate consonants, like nochu, like nichu, whereas Russian has a single consonant plus yod, Surzhyk prefers a single consonant plus yod, nochu. Okay, let's go to some phonological integration to see how that works. On the phonological level, Surzhyk in Serbenska really rests on a gradient continuum between Ukrainian and Russian, but it's not always possible to tell from the data at hand what the actual state of affairs is, because, for instance, we don't know about stress patterns in Surzhyk because it's mostly oral and the stress is not reproduced in a lot of these manuals, so it's hard to tell where it really is and what it's doing. But for instance, the Surzhyk second plural form prichodit is formed according to the regular pattern for suffix stress forms in Ukrainian, as compared with the actual Ukrainian form prichodte. You see where the stress falls on the O. So we have to think that Surzhyk in this case is influenced by the Russian pattern, which is prichodite, But nonetheless, when it comes to forming the suffix, it forms it according to the Ukrainian pattern and not the Russian. Voicing. We talked about this morning in the lecture about G, but I'll just quickly go over it for those of you who weren't there. First of all, we have no information on voicing assimilation in Surzhyk because that is usually never reproduced. But we do know that in Russian consonant clusters, that the last consonant in the cluster, the voicing, determines the voicing of everything ahead of it. So prosba becomes prosba, rizba remains rizba, dushka remains dushka, but duzhka becomes dushka, right? It's voiceless, voiceless, or voiced. And in final position, we know that voiced consonants become voiceless. So plot and plod both sound like T, plot. In Ukrainian, we know that it's not the same story. Prosba becomes prosba, like rizba. It remains rizba. But we have dushka with a voiceless S, a sh before k, but duzhka with a voiced zh before k. There's a contrast in that environment before a tense consonant. And we also know that in final position, the contrast between voicing remains. It's pleat and plead. Another difference is compactness assimilation, whether something remains a dental or a palatal. And in Russian, it's only compact consonants, consonants become compact before compact. So a form like prinyosshi becomes prinyoshi. And baishsa remains baishsa. Whereas in Ukrainian, the compactness goes both ways. A dental can be assimilated to a palatal, as in prinishi, but a palatal can be assimilated to a dental, boisya. We don't know about this information for Surzhyk. There's just not enough to tell us what's going on. Okay, for palatalization, we know that Russian is distinct from Ukrainian. Whereas in the Russian case, notice that, by the way, the little circle means hard, so that Russian has phonemically hard palatals, indicated, a labial indicated by a capital P, soft labials with an apostrophe, hard dentals with a capital T, soft dentals, palatals, hard velars, and soft velars. All those occur in Russian. Whereas in Ukrainian, the only place where we see phonemic softness is in dentals. So that's something to think about. In Surzhyk, we see a resistance to phonemically distinct soft labials before back vowels. So in Russian, you have an example like kovyor, meaning rug, with a soft V, or svyokla, with a soft V before O, meaning beat. Whereas in Surzhyk, that will come out as kovyor, with a hard labial plus yot. And svyokla with a soft labial, which will be actually also a hard labial before yod, but there's a standard rule in Ukrainian that says whenever a labial precedes yod and is preceded by another dental consonant, that the whole thing gets softened. So, in fact, phonemically, it's still doing the same thing. It doesn't have a soft labial, but phonetically it does. Surzhyk is tolerant of Russian phonemically distinct soft dentals before back vowels. So, just as we get stupenyok and pasyolka, we get the same thing in Surzhyk, stupenyok and pasyolka. Now, this is here is an environment before front vowels where we get very distinct patterns of neutralization in Russian and Ukrainian. In Ukrainian, consonants are pronounced hard before I and E, and they're pronounced soft before E. So we have a form like lis that ends in a hard S, and the vocative singular, like, oh, forest. You just say that every day, don't you? Oh, forest. Comes out lisa. The nominative plural is lisi, hard. The genitive plural is lisiu, where the S softens before the E. Whereas babus, which has a soft S to end the stem, is babuseu, hard before E. Babusin, the possessive adjective, hard before E. But babusi, which is the genitive dative locative singular, soft before E. Russian neutralization happens where? We all know this who know Russian, before yeah, right? Where you automatically get a consonant that's paired to be soft. So the form for demon, bies, becomes bies, the soft B. Les becomes lies, the soft L. And ruk, which ends in a hard K, becomes rukye in the dative locative singular. So in the environment before we would say that Russian softening the consonant, as opposed to Ukrainian hardening the consonant, tends to move in the direction of Surzhyk softening the consonant before In other words, Surzhyk behaves in this case more like Russian. And of course a hard T before the I, which would be rendered by Ukrainian phonology as lente. But the more common Surzhyk form, lente, which is written actually L with a yeah to tell you to pronounce it soft, seems to indicate that the Ukrainian neutralization of consonants before to make them hard is overridden by the Russian neutralization of labials, dentals, and velars before that were all rendered soft. So that's why we get these forms like sviet and primierachnu and ubiežala in Surzhyk, because this tends to favor, as I said before, the Russian neutralization. On closer analysis, however, the notion of one phonological rule simply overriding the other cannot account for the Surzhyk forms that have mixed Ukrainian-Russian realizations. So take these examples like the word klever. It does not mean очень umny. This is the word for clover. And we can see that in standard Ukrainian, both the L and the V are hard, klever. Whereas in Surzhyk, the L is soft, but the V is hard, klever. Likewise, in the Russian form pietinka, once again another diminutive form, pietinka, where the P is soft before the and the T is soft before the Notice what we see in the Surzhyk form, petinka. Notice the P is hard. So we already have to therefore make some sort of distinction here. What we seem to see is a hierarchy, and that's represented in C, that the rule of neutralization, the Russian rule of neutralization, is going to happen before if the word is clearly marked as Russian. But that we have to remember that there's a hierarchy involved, and that is that it's more likely that dentals are going to be softened than labials, velars, and palatals. And likewise, that we have to expect that the Russian rule is going to be invoked over the Ukrainian rule. So we can have the form pietinka or pietinka. Either one is possible. But notice, so one is clearly more Ukrainian, the first one. The second is purely copying the Russian. But notice that it also tells us that we cannot get the third form. We cannot get pietinka. We can't get a softened P and have a hardened T, because that's just not the way the hierarchy works. Now, what I've done is, that's about all I've been able to squeeze out of old Serbenska. So what I did was I chose some texts, some short stories by 4 Ukrainian authors, by Bogdan Zholdak, Alexander Irvanets, Mykola Zakusilo, and Volodymyr Danilenko. I know you would like the title of the one by Mykola Zakusilo. It's Vypiryaka Baitska Zyiv, a vampire ate dad. At any rate, I took examples from this and tried to project them onto the chart that I had made for Serbenska to see whether it held up. And it turned out that it actually held up pretty well, although there were some forms, there were more forms that they did have that she didn't have. And I've marked the forms that I got out of literature with the heavy cross as opposed to the ones from Serbenska in the light cross. You can see that the prefixes for adjectives, verbs, and nouns remain exactly the same. They are not Russianized. The suffixes for adjectives are not Russianized, whereas we do get we get the same sort of possibilities for verbs and nouns for suffixes. And then this is interesting. We begin to get some Russianized endings for pronouns and adjectives, which we did not see in Serbenska. But they're still kind of marginal. That's why I have them in parentheses. We don't get them that often. And then finally, even in roots, which is where we got them more often, we even see sometimes in pronouns, which we didn't see in Srbenska. So let me give you some examples of the sort of thing that I found in the literature. Rare demonstratives like этот негодяй, this lowlife, versus Ukrainian say nehidnik, or a reflexive like начинай свое дело, as opposed to Ukrainian починай свое дело, or a third person rare вместо нее rather than заместь ней. The adjective, the substantivized adjective like з проходной as opposed to z prochidnoi. And a noun with a preposition in the locative vosnya, I mean absolutely right out of Russian, as opposed to the Ukrainian usni. And then there were some examples where different authors just did different things. Now this may mean that one is careless and the other isn't in reflecting these forms, or that there's some sort of alternations going on in Surzhyk itself. So we can have the form diskoteka in Irvinets, but diskoteka also in Irvinets. This is in one and the same author. He uses both forms. Laher in Irvinets as opposed to lahir. Again, whether he's just sloppy or whether this does really reflect different possibilities within the language, it remains to be seen. Особенно with a softened B. Ukrainian не можу, used by Zholdak, as opposed to не mohu, used by Zholdak. One and the same author uses both. The first is the Ukrainian form, the second the Surzhyk form. And then some evidence of vowel reduction. Remember we said we didn't have much evidence about stress, so it's hard to tell. But Surzhyk has хорошо, не достиг, which corresponds to Russian не достиг, красавец, as opposed to Russian krasavets, and Surzhyk конечно, as opposed to Russian конечно, where again it looks like there's akanya in the first pretonic syllable, but no akanya at the end, which is kind of strange. So we make a slightly revised Surzhyk rule for Russified consonant crossing, where we see that overall there tends to be actually more Russianized softening if that a is stressed as opposed to when it is not. When it is not, there's a possibility that it will not be softened. We see that up there in 18a2 with lahir as opposed to lahir. So here are some examples in civilian life. Surzhyk na grajdanki, where there's no softening, compared with Russian na grajdanki. Surzhyk na kushetki, as opposed to Russian na kushetki, where the k is softened. And Surzhyk osobino, as opposed to Russian osobino. So overall, we can step back from all this and see that there are a certain number of hierarchies of Russification in Surzhyk that correlate well with what we've been able to find so far in the manuals and in the literature that represents Surzhyk. That Russification is more likely in transfers directly from Russian than it is with correlations, than it is with calques, than it is from native words. And that makes perfect sense. You would think that the native Ukrainian word would resist the Russification the most, whereas the word that's just borrowed in from Russian would be most likely to undergo Russification. Those that are bound in every way by Russian, the suffixes are all Russian, the root is Russian, are of course more likely to than those that are bound Ukrainian. Nouns are more likely to be Russified than verbs, than adjectives, than non-personal pronouns and personal pronouns. Those are the least likely to be Russified. Roots are more likely than suffixes, are more likely than endings, and prefixes are the most resistant to Russification. And then we saw that the examples of certain morphophonemic alternations that were attracted to Russian as opposed to Ukrainian, and that still holds. And then finally, the one that I just gave you, where stress over the e plays a factor in how commonly Russian will actually be used to soften that consonant before the e. Even such gross measurement is suggestive of a Ukrainian base in Surzhyk, capable of resisting Russification through probability scales that vary according to the functional role of each element in the sentence and through hierarchies of implicational relationships that tend to favor or disfavor the appropriation of Russian features. Some Russianisms may be incorporated into Surzhyk under the right circumstances, whereas others are impossible. In the last analysis, at least for the time being, Serbenska is inaccurate in her assessment that anything goes. As in the other cases of code mixing, there are ordered hierarchies that determine in a principled way the means by which Russian will interact with the Ukrainian base. Surzhyk plays by the rules. They're just not the rules she is used to. And the ultimate outcome, of course, is anybody's guess. Kamsahamnida.